I start today with a reminder, because I think sometimes as we get involved in our discussion of government in the United States, we forget who actually is the source of authority for our government. And we forget it in two ways. We forget the ultimate source, and then we forget the proximate source of authority, the one without whose involvement the authority has no validity in our country, at least for the time being. And one of the reasons I spent so much time talking to people and trying to wake them up is that that's a purposeful and intentional result. And so I don't usually begin my talks by going to the end first. But this time I think it's important to do so. Because we are in the midst, I do believe, of the greatest existential crisis that the people of the United States have ever faced. I think that if I were making odds right this minute, based on the available evidence and the trends of things up to now, I would have to tell you that, as Lincoln once said, the United States of America is going, gone. Every force practically in the world is now arrayed against the survival of this country. And it is arrayed against us because we have done too much good, because we have stood too many times in the way of evil, because we have become what we were supposed to become, an obstacle to all those forces in human history and on the earth that gather together in order to obstruct God's good will for humanity and prevent human beings from walking the righteous path of that good will which God intended. I think it's in so many ways a miracle how many times the people of this country have responded to the call of that identity. They had, of course, to do so in order for the United States to come into existence in the first place. And that call was issued by providential miracle in the right way and for the sake of the right truth. And that fact came about because the leaven in this loaf, the salt of the saltness that became the spirit and heart of the people of the United States, was faith in our Lord Jesus Christ and the elevation by Christ and by those who follow him of the authority of God. There is no human authority to challenge that authority, and there is no source of that authority that can substitute for it. No power, no force, no military conquest, no intellectual triumph, no achievement can, in fact, parallel the achievement of God himself in all creation. And our country was founded on that simple understanding. The very first premise stated by the people of the United States when they came forward and stood in the face of the world to announce their existence as a people. When they first said that we're coming forward to assume among the powers of the earth that station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them. That's what they said. And it should be sort of almost simple, like simple math. 1 and 1 make 2. Right? 1 minus 1 equals 0. America minus God equals no America at all. Why? Because the first ground we stood on, the ground we stood on to claim what all the philosophers and all the historians and all the mighty conquerors and all the potentates and even all the high priests of the world had ever proclaimed. And that is that you could not have a government entrusted to the hands of the whole people. That there must be a human master so that the rules will be enforced, so that the laws will be made according to some will that will be consistent. The people will always dissolve into inaction, inactivity, confusion, and failure. That was the general verdict of all of human history. Until we, the people of the United States, refuted it by our action and activity under the Constitution of the United States. It's funny that our politicians don't talk about this much anymore. As a matter of fact, most of them have gone to schools that told them that, well, the American exceptionalism, as they call it. And they always tried, I don't know. I think they always try to pretend that it had something to do with our exceptional material success, our exceptional power, and all of this. Nothing at all meant like that in the phrase American exceptionalism. We were the exception to the rule that all governments of, by, and for the people fail. And they fail in a short time. And instead of failing, what did we do? We moved forward again and again, fighting our demons, fighting our evils, fighting those things that in the past had spelled the doom of governments based upon the will and goodwill of the people. We triumphed over them all. And that victory was the exception that proved us to be a people worthy of the name. And yet that's what they want to deny us. And I would have to tell you, sometimes I get to this point, but again I say, that I think we need to start here. We think that what we're talking about today is whether or not we kill innocent babies in the womb, innocent babies at the hands of their mothers in every respect. We just get to let people murder them, and we think that's what we're talking about. But in point of fact, what we're really talking about is the government-sanctioned withdrawal of personhood from a class of persons, and that class of persons does not represent this race or the other race. It does not represent this religion, that religion, or the other religion. It does not represent any group or association of human beings. That group of persons represents all humanity. And if you withdraw the protection against murder from all of humanity, then you have licensed every slaughter, such as those massive slaughters that have claimed hundreds of millions of lives, perpetrated in the Soviet Union, perpetrated in communist China and North Korea and Vietnam, and slated to be perpetrated in the United States against the people that have come to this country to represent every race and color and creed and kind on the face of the earth. Our fate portends the fate of all humanity, and the slaughter of our children in the womb portends the subjection of hundreds of millions of human beings throughout the world to that same massive slaughter we have already seen, country by country by country, mostly curtailed and defeated and contained because of the existence and dedication of the American people to the just rule of God. Why are we retreating from our vocation? Huh? Oh, well, I'll tell you why. Partly we're retreating from our vocation because of a defect in ourselves, but it's a defect that has been carefully induced. That defect carefully induced pretty much over the course of my entire lifetime, beginning with a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States that called into question whether there could be prayer in our public schools, including a decision, Roe v. Wade, that removed the question of whether it was okay to murder innocent human beings. And you would say, well, no, their decision was about whether to murder babies in the womb. No, it was about whether to murder innocent human beings. People unequivocally recognized as human beings. I don't care what Mr. Justice Blackmun had to say. I don't care the phony reasoning he used. I don't care the number of examples he drew from this place and that. What on earth do the pagan poets and the pagan desires and the regimes of absolutism have to do with a regime of liberty grounded in the notion that all righteousness, all right, all justice comes from God through individual people who are willing to walk the way and do his will? They have nothing to do with us at all. And when he cited them in his Supreme Court decisions, his decision and his arguments were totally irrelevant to the United States of America. Why did we not say so when it was done? And why are we still not saying so now? And I really don't get it. Because, I don't know, perhaps at the time the decision occurred, it was unexpected in its implications. It has taken us all these years since then to explore them to the full, but now our society is exploring them. We have no right to deny the consequences. Our consciences are seared, our families are dissolving, and our union as a people, not as a group of states, our union as a people, grounded in the dedication of individual hearts to the understanding that every human being comes into this world filled with the Word of God, which impels them to do right according to the terms of his will. That's the true meaning of God-endowed, unalienable right. Right there, written in the words that distinguish our nature from the nature of everything else in creation, is the will of God that we should do right according to the terms of his will. That's why it's called God-endowed, unalienable. That is inseparable from our nature as human beings. Right. And it's time we dismiss totally and forever the false understanding of the libertarians and the others that say, it's about freedom. It's not about freedom. It's about the right use of freedom according to the will of God. Amen. We do not stand together as gangsters, as evildoers, as bad people determined to have our own way. That understanding of government has nothing whatsoever to do with the good people of the United States. Have you read the Declaration? I often like to point out to people that right there, several times, they make it very clear. And I think if Bernie Sanders is listening, somebody should tell him this. See? This is an aside, of course, but you do know that he came out the other day and has actually expressed his enthusiastic support for the idea that convicted felons should be allowed to vote from prison. Now, meaning no offense, I know that we can't put absolute faith and trust in our legal system. The very topic we're discussing proves that, but leave that aside. We can perhaps put enough faith in our jury system to suggest that the hope and prayer to God that more times than not they put the right people in jail when they have the right information to do so, leaves us with the ability to say that if you're sitting in jail convicted of a crime, especially a felony, we can't really regard you as a good citizen. We can't regard you as a good person, because good people don't engage in such criminal activities. And when the founders talked about the founding of the United States, guess what they said? Everybody likes to act as if governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that governed means everybody who's living there. No, it doesn't. Because on several occasions in the Declaration, they make it very clear that the people writing that document represented the good people of the colonies, the good people of the United States. I know there are those who think that they were that's just an affectation of the time, like, my good man. You don't really mean that he's a good man. They really meant the good people. Because when they stated the criterion for right according to the Creator God, right endowed by the Creator God, they laid out the truth about those who had chosen to come together to form the United States. That covenant, that coming together, was a coming together not in the arbitrary will of this and that and those human beings. It was the coming together of people who in their heart, in their mind, in their spirit, in their work, in their dedication to their families, in their founding of their communities, had already chosen to do right, to exercise right, according to the will of God. They came together not in their own wills, but in the performance of His will, for the good of humanity, for the good of all creation. They came together in the spirit of their faith, which said to those who founded the United States that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and walk in His righteousness. They came together in their faith in Jesus Christ, who said, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. Those were the good people of the United States. And those are the only people who are prima facie entitled to exercise the sovereign power that God has delegated to us as a people. In this respect, that the great founder was right when he said, that it was John Adams, I think, that the Constitution of the United States was framed for a moral and a religious people. It is entirely inadequate to the government of any other. Now, we're proving the point. See, because if you want to walk down the walk of murder, if you want to walk down the walk of theft and lying and deceit and treachery, if you want to walk the walk that turns its back on the responsibility to humankind that is involved in the commitment to procreation, the responsibility to all creation that is involved in doing what we ought to do according to the will of that Creator God from whom we claim our rights. If you are involved in all of that, then you have the character to govern, because you are already governed by God. And that is often a question I used to put when I go through the Declaration and they say consent of the government. Did it ever occur to you to ask what government? See, that's a fair question to ask when you remember the circumstances of the Declaration. The circumstances of the Declaration were such that they were declaring their independence and their rebellion against and their rejection of the government of the King of Great Britain. And they hadn't yet sat down to agree on what was going to be the shape of a government for the whole United States. All they had were the Articles of Confederation, which were basically the terms on which they had decided to cooperate in the war to vindicate their Declaration of Independence. They were, in that respect, the people as a whole. The states had their governments, but the people as a whole had no government ratified by the people as a whole at all. They were between governments, as it were. So what were they talking about? Government based on the consent of the governed. That's quite obvious, since the first word out of their mouths evoked the authority of God, that they were talking about the government of God. And we must still talk about that government in the first instance, if we mean to retain the liberty that is only possible, not because He gave it to us, but because He made us in such a way as to respond, to have the capacity to do His will, abide by the terms of His righteousness, follow the word that He has built into the very fabric of our nature, so that we can choose to walk the walk of His righteousness, and therefore claim, among other things, the capacity as well as the opportunity to be to ourselves what kings have claimed to be to other human beings, because we are to God what God requires of all kings, those who are obedient to his will. That's the logic of our existence. And it is that logic that is now rejected when we step away from the first premises of that word which he has built into us. And this is something that, it always bothers me because we talk about all these different issues like they're separate, when in point of fact, they're not separate. The issue, for instance, of the nature and character and strength of our family life. People in this country seem to want to come forward with every possible explanation for problems in the family and dissolution of the family and difficulty of sustaining families and so forth, except the obvious one. We're killing our children. The family exists in order to perpetuate humanity in the form of the children that result from the serious and permanent union of heart and mind and will as well as body of a man and a woman. Okay? Back away from that understanding of what procreation is about and what happens to the family. It has to suffer dissolution because there is no permanent ground for its existence. The permanent ground for the existence of the family is in that human commitment to act on procreation according to the will of God. We should expect nothing else but that our family should dissolve if we back away from our willingness to respect that commitment. And that's what's happening. We should also respect nothing else than at the end of the day, that dissolution will result in the loss of our sense of identity. Identity as individuals, weakening until it disappears. And identity as a nation. Now all of this then traces itself back to this willingness in order to assert licentious sexuality to back away from the serious purpose of God for the very existence of our individual human beings. We exist as individuals so that the image of God, the image and likeness of God in us may be perpetuated, but also so that something else may be reproduced, as it were, even as we produce our humanity. What else is that? It's a little bit of a contradiction. It's hard to grasp because look at the world. Think of all the various things that even just standing here, I can look out there and without even thinking about the cars and all the other things we have made, I can see the trees and think of the sky and the grass and the plants and the animals. There's such diversity in the world. Such a manifold manifestation of variety. Differences that, as it turns out, when they examine them more deeply, there are differences that go right down to the very most minute particles and activities of the energy that make us up as objects in the world. Isn't that fascinating? Everything requiring that one thing be different from another. But the fascinating thing about what they seem to be discovering is that everything has to be different from everything else, but in some fashion that reflects the same way of being. We're being different. What we're being different according to the same understanding of being itself. Our science even now, able to acknowledge, if it could only think it through, that there is God in the midst of what we claim is our newly discovered knowledge, but a knowledge that he shared with us almost from the very beginning in that innate sense we have, that though we see a world filled with diversity, yet there is behind it a world in which the Shemitah is true. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord of us, the Lord is one. And has it ever occurred to you that in a way that I think is self-consciously unique to the United States, our nation has been embarked on an effort to fulfill that truth about all of creation, Behold, we are many, but out of many, God makes us one. Our motto captured it. But our hearts and so many of our leaders and so many of the false promisers of utopia now beguile us with the thought that we can still survive once we have rejected the God in whom we trust for that ground of unity, which allows us to stand together despite all our differences, loving each other in the same way that he has chosen to love us. When we think of it, I think it's beautiful. It all works. And it all has worked. It has worked to produce a diverse people struggling with the usual and ordinary evils of our humanity. I mean, all the folks who look back and, oh, America's so awful, we had slaves and slave owners and so forth and so on. Come on, y'all. Not a single one of them has an iota of background in which, if you trace it back and back and back, you don't find slaveholders and conquerors enslaving and kidnappers enslaving. Every single race, every single reason, every single nation on earth guilty of this sin. What was the first nation to stand on the ground of God's justice? A justice that declared that to do all that to any human being. And that's the key thing. See? Some people have said, don't do that to us. You can't enslave Englishmen. You can't enslave Spaniards. You can't enslave the Hispanic people. You can't enslave Africans. You can't enslave Kenyans and all these folks. No, don't enslave us. But we have the power, we enslave others. And what nation was first based on the premise that accepted God's understanding that kidnapping folks into slavery was bad no matter whom you kidnapped? That denying the image and likeness of God in other human beings was bad no matter who it was or what name they bore or what tribe they came from, in whom you denied it. That too was our exceptional mission as a people. And that too is the mission that through this abortion holocaust, which is only the tip of their spear, they mean to open our gut so that we spill out the contents of our inward being and destroy the promise of the life of all humanity that we have gathered here to fulfill in God's name and to represent. This is what's at stake. Now, I very much appreciate the fact that John has gone through some of the challenges and boiled them down, I think, in a way that helps us to understand that the issue that's in front of us is no longer very complicated. I don't think it ever was, really. We spent a lot of time, the last 20, 30, 40 years, however, wandering about in a kind of Supreme Court created wilderness. And we ended up, unfortunately, like the Israelites in the wilderness, we ended up worshiping an idol of power. See? An idol of power. We used the word law, but what we really meant was the exercise of power. Right? Because our branches of government represent the power of government, right? And suddenly, here we were in the midst of a time when it was claimed that by the power of government, you could take away the personhood, not just of this human being or that group of human beings or some other group of human beings. You could take away the personhood of humanity itself from the very beginning and conception of its presence in the world. Why didn't we understand? Why don't we understand today that the implication of withdrawing humanity from our nascent posterity in the womb was to withdraw the protection of humanity from every human being on earth? It should be obvious, it should be clear, it should be plain. It has now been proven scientifically beyond a doubt that you say, that's not a human being, that's just a mass of cells. It was always a lie. And now it has been shown to be a lie in the discovery of DNA that satisfies the requirement and confirms the truth that we have a rational nature. Rational means, by the way, that it didn't get there by chance. How come they always say that and forget that that's what rational means? See? It wasn't an accident. Didn't just happen randomly by some whimsical and arbitrary this or that. We're made that way. And as every human being is made that way and reflects the intention of that humanity from the moment of conception, that's what draws, as John said, the Constitution into the mix and proves what we should all here today make clear as the purpose now of the pro-life movement. The purpose of the pro-life movement is first to disentangle ourselves from the whole skein of arbitrary consequences and irrational conclusions involved in the jurisprudence that depends on the Roe v. Wade decision. Roe v. Wade is dead. Roe v. Wade was always in contradiction with itself. But that internal contradiction has now, by the weight of our advancing scientific knowledge, collapsed it. It no longer exists. When they come to you and say, we'll appoint this justice and that justice, you tell them the truth. The Supreme Court itself declared that if the suggestion of personhood be established, which has been established beyond doubt by our empirical science, the Roe, the complainant's case, the case of Roe in Roe v. Wade, collapses. It has collapsed. We don't need to ask them if it has collapsed, because logic, reason, and the words of the decision itself tell us that Roe has collapsed. It has met the criteria that they themselves established for its collapse, and it is gone. They cannot make us serve a Supreme Court opinion that was always doubtfully lawful, and that now by its own weight, by its own words, does not even exist. You've got to tell this to everyone. The lawyers are like the king that had no clothes now where abortion is concerned. Abortion wears no constitutional covering. That covering is gone. We are left with the clear, plain language of the Constitution and the responsibility to enforce the words that not only should protect the innocent children, but that actually must be respected if any of us are to be protected from the abuses of government. For if personhood no longer entails the requirement of due process and the equal protection of the law for any person, then it endangers the innocence of all people. And we are in grave danger now. Right at this moment, we have withdrawn from that protection because of our obdurate lack of understanding of what is being done to us. And now we're flirting with putting into power the very people who profess the ideology that has in every instance followed through on the withdrawal of that personhood to slaughter hundreds of millions of people. I don't care if people tell me, well, the millennials don't understand it, they don't know anything, and so forth and so on. It is the responsibility of every generation as we age to age into the responsibility to stand unto death for the truth that is required so that our posterity may escape the evils of history. Have we lost our guts? Have we lost our minds? Have we lost our heart? Have we lost our courage? It does not matter if oncoming generations are ignorant. What matters is whether we will stand and never quail in telling the truth, in representing that truth, no matter what the consequences they threaten us with. And that's what gathers us here today. That's what should gather together every pro-life person. That's what should tug on the sense of responsibility of every American we have uplifted into offices of executive power at any level in our government. But we must do it, by the way, remembering something that is really important to me. And I was taught this lesson in my own experience in the campaign of 1996, because it is true what John said. I didn't get up in 1996. Who was I? I was nobody. I'd spent a little time in government by then, and I'd done a few chores in the State Department, and so forth and so on. But by the standards that I at least thought should apply, I've revised my sense, by the way, of the standards that people are applying for admission to the office of President of the United States, because the American people seem to have lowered their standards considerably in the course of the last several decades. But that's neither here nor there. I kind of knew that standard at the time was rather higher than having been a second or third level official at the State Department for a while. But that's not why I entered into the race. I entered the race because the Republican Party at the time was withdrawing from its commitment to the pro-life plank, and I thought that somebody ought to get up and say that. And when I watched as other people, including folks I thought I could trust, to get into that fray and clearly articulate that there could be no retreat whatsoever from the moral issues that are the foundation of our very identity. As I watch these very people back away and start to equivocate, talk about big tents and all of this, there is no big tent going to be upheld in America when we have torn down the pole that holds the whole thing up, which connects us to the authority of our Lord God. Remove that moral premise, and we have removed everything that upholds our authority and our existence as a people and as a nation. And that's what they were saying we could survive, and I don't believe we can survive it. And frankly, looking at what's going on in many ways since then, I frankly don't believe we have survived it. I think we've lurched along through challenges and difficulties, and the thing that I think we ought to be most struck with, as if you read the Bible, you can sometimes be struck. Have you ever asked yourself, what kind of God is that? How many times did God forgive the Israelites? They did this, they did that. He corrected them. They went back to the idols. He corrected them. They went back to the idols. They stepped away from him and sinned and upheld idolatry time and time again. And still, he came back and said, all right, if you just do this and you just do that, you come back. Put up kings. If you just get them to do this and that, they can come back into my graces. I have not abandoned my people. I think God seems to have that attitude toward America. And I don't want to get into too much of the political thises and that's, but I think it is without a doubt true that what happened in the election of 2016 was much like the providential acts to which George Washington ascribed some of the victories of the Americans during the early parts of the Revolutionary War. But don't you think, and here I have to part company with some folks, maybe even some folks I like a lot and work with, but I can't ascribe this to Donald Trump. I've been impressed with Donald Trump's willingness to stay the course in these things that he promised he was going to do to represent the constituency that elected him. That's better than folks who never keep their promises, never try even to stay with the promises they offer to their constituents. I'm still waiting, however, to be confirmed in the evidence that isn't a matter of calculation, but of deep and sincere commitment to the salvation of our country. And I'm not sure I see it. And I don't think it's the fault of Donald Trump. I think it's our fault. Because I don't think we should put our faith in any princes. We should not put our faith in the princes who lift themselves up on the strength of their arrogant power. We should not put our faith in the princes who lift themselves up on the faith of their arrogant intellectual and technological achievements. We shouldn't put faith in any such princes at all. For God has not called us into existence as a people to put faith anywhere but in Him. And to require no leadership but the leadership of God in Jesus Christ, so that we will walk the walk that saves our nation. We will show the way to those who come forward offering to help us open that way. But at the end of the day, we will not be successful until we have prayed, until we have repented, until we have committed to do what is necessary, even unto death. So that the promise of our country, not to each other and not to our posterity, but to God Almighty, will be fulfilled. Now that was, I believe, the dedication of previous generations of Americans. It's why it turns my stomach now to listen to all these advocates of socialism and communism and other forms of human political depravity tell us that we should trust in their word, trust in them, while they rip down the images and destroy the reminiscences of the victories that had to be won by previous generations over the evils that plagued this country as the surviving elements of the evils identified in our creed as the ones we exist to oppose. If we forget the battles, then we forget the virtue of the people who fought those battles. If we forget the villains, then we forget the hard evil that they had to battle against. We should remember every name. We should remember every enslaver. We should remember every general who battled for slavery, every general who battled for freedom. We should remember every politician who took a stand against slavery, and every politician who sought to expand its enslaving power. And we should remember all that it took for this nation to come together and on both sides wade through fields of blood until the judgment of God announced itself and his righteousness was vindicated. We should never forget one moment of it, lest we forget ourselves and forget to take the dedication to justice that committed this nation to those battles. And in forgetting it, deprive our posterity of the chance to remember and preserve their liberty. This is what's happening now. And we've got to resolve to stop it. And the only way we can resolve is to begin ourselves. We must form a massive army. Armed not with weapons and swords and knives and all these things. Communists eventually force us into that when we have to defend ourselves. But we can win this battle by the word and logic of God Almighty. We can win it by reminding the people who are still greatly in the majority in America that for all the confusion of our different denominations, that for all the surrenders of right and so much of our church leadership and formal leadership, what really matters in America is not what the leaders do, but what those who are supposed to lead them demand that they must do. And that's us. We must come together by the tens, by the hundreds, by the thousands, and then by the millions. First, to demand an end to the scourge that represents the death of all humanity. For the blows we strike against our children in the womb are blows struck to destroy humanity itself. And we must end that destruction now. Amen. Now, I happen to believe that there are a lot of people who are ready for this message. But I think everyone who is able to hear these words, everyone who comes within reach of them, has to begin to think the way I think that many people in our history. First, the early Christians had to think. Christians like the martyr Stephen. I've often marveled every time I read that passage in Acts. It's just marvelous. What was Stephen up to? What did he see in that moment? When he spoke the truth and filled with anger, they moved, their teeth gnashing him and their hands reaching to hurl him in the end to death. What was he seeing? He was seeing the glory of God. And he stood before them in a pacific vision, peaceful that is, that saw the Son of God in all his glory, at the right hand of God, coming in glory and righteousness. Is this not our vision still? Can we not see past the threats and the anger and the lies and the intimidation, knowing that as we stand for truth, we already stand beside the Lord in his coming? That as we ourselves come to the conclusion that the evil must end, we are brought home to the conclusion that elevates the power and rule of God, not over just our country and our world, but all of his creation. This is our calling. And what should lead us to relent in this calling? What should lead us to feel intimidated in this vision of peaceful glory? What can they bring against us that can defeat the power of God? Nothing. That's who we are, or at least that's who we were when Christians deserved the name and were willing to walk the path to Calvary with a clear vision that beyond the suffering and beyond the dripping blood and beyond the pain, there lies the fulfillment and fruition of God's good will. And we are already there if we stand for the truth right now, right here, and do not equivocate. Are you ready to answer that challenge? As I think God is ready to help you if you do. Are you ready to stand in that demand? Because I got to tell you, I have met with governors. I hope to meet with some more, and some have impressed me. And I think that there are several that I know of and have met that they're ready. They would like to do something. But remember how God winnowed things down so that there were only 300 left to win the battle for Gideon? I'm not sure he's winnowing things down right now. I think he wants to build things up. I think he is looking at all of us who think that we're so small, we don't matter, and we're just one individual, and so forth and so on. He's demanding. No, the only way their hearts are going to commit is when the heart of this people commits. Because the true leaders in America are not sitting in the governor's chairs or in the White House. They're sitting at the dinner table. They're sitting in the workplace. They're sitting right here in this room. And we either show the courage to defeat this evil or they will not. Do we understand that? Because that's what government of, by, and for the people means when we remember that at the end of the day it is not our strength and power that we rely upon. If we have any capacity for government at all, it is because we have surrendered our vanity, surrendered our pride, surrendered our ambition, surrendered even all hope of our own making in order to live in the hope of God that made the world and that alone can once again make and keep us a free people because we are willing to stand in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free.